They called him Griffin Hale, but no one had seen him in 3 winters. High in the barren ice fields of the northern Yukon, where the wind howled like wolves and even the stars seemed to shiver, stood a lone cabin at the edge of nowhere. A flickering chimney was the only sign of life for miles. That was Griffin's world. Snow, silence, and survival. The sun barely climbed above the mountains this time of year. When it did, it left behind a cold, blue light that kissed the snow but offered no warmth. The cold wasn't just in the air. It was in the bones, in the silence, in the breath that hung frozen for seconds too long. Griffin lived alone. By choice. By punishment. Each morning his routine was carved in ice. Chop wood, melt snow, inspect the perimeter, make sure the wind turbines hadn't frozen stiff overnight. His fingers were callous, his beard frosted white, his boots cracked from 100 days of trudging through the same lifeless paths. There were no roads, no visitors, no mail, no voices, except for the occasional murmur of the wind pressing its ghostly hands against the cabin walls. He used to speak, used to laugh, used to sing lullabies by the fire. But that was a different man, from a life long buried. 3 years ago, his wife Anna and daughter Lily boarded a small seaplane in Whitehorse. A quick return trip from a short holiday in town. Griffin had waved from the dock, smiling beneath the rising sun. They never came back. The wreckage was found 5 days later, scattered across a frozen inlet, gnawed by ice and silence. No bodies, just a broken watch, a child's mitten, and a charred teddy bear that had once been Lily's favorite. She called it Fire Cub. Now, Griffin kept it on a shelf beside the radio that hadn't worked since. He had buried everything after that, his past, his hope, and eventually his name, in the world he now inhabited. There were no clocks. He marked time by the way the frost thickened around the window panes. The crackling of the fire, the dripping of snowmelt from his boots, the ticking of old memories like time bombs in the dark. He ate sparingly. He slept lightly. He spoke to no one. Sometimes he wrote in a journal, not words, just tally marks. Days survived. Nights endured. A way to measure a life that had stopped living. One morning, Griffin stood outside his cabin, wrapped in layers of fur and wool. The sky was bruised pink, the kind of quiet dawn that felt like an apology. He looked out the expanse of untouched snow, endless and pure, the kind of place where even thoughts had trouble crossing. A fox had passed by during the night. Its paw prints dotted the snow near his shed, fading off into the woods like ellipses. Ellipses. He hadn't thought of that word in a long time. Lily used to write stories about animals, talking bears and wolves who made pancakes, foxes with glasses who solved mysteries. She used ellipses too much, because it makes you wonder what happens next, she once told him. Griffin stared at the fox tracks until the wind erased them. He wasn't scared of the wilderness. He was part of it now. He knew which berries would be eaten, how to read the clouds, how to walk without leaving a trail. His relationship with nature was respectful, distant, like 2 old neighbors who nodded from across the yard but never shared a fence. There were wolves here. He heard them sometimes. Bears, too, though they were deep in hibernation now. Once, a moose wandered near his cabin and stared through the window for what felt like hours. Griffin didn't move. Neither did the moose. 2 creatures lost in a world they didn't ask for. He was alive, but not really living. That thought repeated often, sometimes aloud, sometimes in the corner of his mind like a whispered truth. The fire inside him hadn't died. It had simply frozen, like the lake behind the cabin. Still, silent, waiting for spring that may never come. The radio on the shelf still had dust on the dial. He turned it once every week, pretending to check the battery. But he knew the truth. He didn't want to hear a voice, because if he did, it meant the silence was no longer protecting him. Silence had become his armor, and grief his only companion. One night, as a blizzard wrapped the world in thick white blindness, Griffin sat by the fire holding a mug of pine tea. His fingers shook, not from cold, But from memory, he pulled the small stuffed bear from the shelf. Fire cub. It was burned on one side, the fur singed black. He hadn't held it in over a year. He clutched it now like a relic, pressing it against his chest. The fire hissed beside him. The wind moaned like something alive. He imagined Lily's voice, not the sound of it, but the rhythm, the joy, the wild music of a child who believed wolves could talk and stars were stories. Griffin whispered a name he hadn't said in years. Lily. It hurt, more than the cold, more than the silence. He didn't cry. He had no more tears left to give. Instead, he placed Fire Cub gently on the windowsill, facing out toward the woods, toward whatever world still breathed beyond the snow. Outside, the storm gathered strength, and somewhere beyond the wind and frost and regret, something was listening. The storm hadn't let up in 2 days. Snow clung to the windows like frostbitten hands, and the wind shrieked through the trees like a warning no one could understand. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, its light dancing in the empty spaces between the walls and the memories. Griffin sat beside it motionless, wrapped in an old wool blanket, watching the flames fight for breath. Then, a sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Knock, scratch, whine. At first, he thought it was a tree limb snapping under ice, or the roof groaning under too much weight. But then it came again, thud, thud, scratch. He reached for the axe by the door, quiet and alert. His instincts, honed by isolation and survival, moved faster than thought. He pressed an eye to the frosted window. Nothing, just white. He listened harder. And then came the sound that didn't belong in this frozen wilderness. A low, strangled whine, not mechanical, not wind, animal, alive, hurting. Griffin unlatched the door slowly, the cold slapping in the face like a warning. Snow spiraled in sideways. He peered out and froze. There, collapsed in the snow, just steps from his porch, was a wolf. Not a typical gray or timber wolf. An Arctic wolf, larger than most, with a thick coat turned crimson near its rear leg, matted with blood and ice. Its chest heaved shallowly. One paw reached forward. Then another. It didn't growl. It didn't run. It tried to crawl to him. Griffin stepped back in disbelief. A full-grown wolf, alone, wounded, dragging itself through a storm to his door? It was impossible. It was suicide. It was intentional? The animal lifted its head weakly, eyes meeting his, not wild, not blank, but pleading. The softest, most vulnerable sound escaped its throat, a high-pitched whimper so human, so filled with pain and desperation, that Griffin's grip on the axe loosened. The old rules came screaming back. Never approach wounded predators. Injury can trigger aggression. Keep the boundary between wild and man. Help no one. Trust nothing. Survive alone. He stood in the doorway, heart pounding, staring at the creature that defied every one of those rules. The snow piled around her. Yes, her. He could see it now. She was no more than 5 or 6 feet from his boots. Her white coat was blotched with streaks of gray and red. Her breathing labored, ribs visible beneath her matted fur. She was dying, but she had come to him. Why? For a long moment, neither of them moved. The blizzard howled between them. Then, with a whimper of exhaustion, the wolf lowered her head to the ground and did something no wild animal had ever done before. She bowed, not like prey, not like submission, but offering, as if asking for help and accepting what might come. Griffin's mind raced. He should shut the door. He should walk away. But then another sound, softer this time, a kind of muffled chirp from the trees. Griffin stepped off the porch, boots crunching through ice, and followed the sound a few paces. A second whimper, high-pitched, faint, from beyond the snow bank near his generator. Another cry, then another. Griffin's breath caught. He rounded the mound and saw 2 small shapes curled beneath a frostbitten spruce. Pups. Wolf cubs. barely larger than footballs, covered in snow, trembling weak. They didn't run. They could barely lift their heads. Griffin spun to the adult wolf. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were still on him. And now he understood. She hadn't come to him for herself. She had come to save her children. His jaw clenched. His brain screamed, "Don't interfere." But something ancient and deep inside him, the part that once read bedtime stories and carried a girl on his shoulders, roared louder. He went to the cubs first. They didn't resist as he scooped them up, one under each arm. They were cold to the touch, but still breathing. He wrapped them in the blanket around his shoulders, pressed them against his chest, and hurried back toward the cabin. The mother watched. She tried to stand, but her leg gave out. Her body collapsed again, breath huffing clouds into the snow. Griffin paused. He should have closed the door, stayed safe. But something had shifted in him. He stepped back outside. The cold tore at his lungs. His boots sank. His fingers burned. He walked to the mother wolf and knelt beside her. Slowly, gently. She didn't snarl, didn't flinch, didn't fight. He reached beneath her front legs and hoisted, straining, slipping, until she was partly over his shoulders. The weight was enormous, the pain immediate, but he didn't stop. Step by step, Griffin Hale carried a full-grown Arctic wolf into his home, and the world changed. Inside the cabin, chaos turned into purpose. The fire was stoked into a blaze. The cubs were wrapped in thermal blankets and cradled near the hearth. Griffin worked in silence, hands trembling, doing what little he could: warm water, crushed antibiotics from his first aid kit, cleaned wounds, stitched lacerations, applied pressure. He talked to her, not because she could understand, but because he needed to say something to someone after 3 years of silence. "You're lucky you found me," he whispered, wiping the blood from her flank. "Or maybe I'm the lucky one." The mother lay still, eyes following his every movement. Not fearfully, but with trust. She didn't resist, even as he cleaned the ragged gash in her hind leg. It looked like a metal snare had caught her, illegal traps left behind by careless poachers. And yet, instead of attacking, she had crawled miles, through a storm, to the only fire burning for miles. To him. That night, Griffin didn't sleep. He tended to the wolves like children, feeding them drops of water from a spoon, adding logs of fire, checking their breath, listening to the wind grow weaker outside. At one point, one of the pups stirred and let out a soft, sleepy howl. Griffin smiled, actually smiled, and something deep inside him, something frozen stiff for years, shifted, cracked, melted. By dawn, the blizzard had stopped. Griffin stood at the window, staring at the endless white. Behind him, the wolf cubs snored softly near the fire. Their mother lay breathing, her eyes closed in fragile rest. He turned to look at them all, these strange, unexpected guests that crashed through the silence of his exile and reminded him what it meant to care. He didn't ask for them. He didn't expect them. But they had come anyway, because something in them believed that someone would answer. And for the first time in 3 years, Griffin was no longer waiting for something to end. He was waiting for something to begin. The storm had passed, but the real battle had only just begun. Griffin stood over the mother wolf, her side rising and falling in weak, irregular pulses. She was alive, for now, but the wound on her leg was deeper than he'd first realized. Infection had already begun to set in. The pups were doing better. They huddled together near the fire, warm and still breathing, their small bellies rising and falling like waves lapping a quiet shore. They made small sounds in their sleep, soft yips, tiny groans, as if dreaming of warmth and milk and a mother who wasn't bleeding out in a stranger's cabin. Griffin turned away from the fire and walked to the storage room. He opened a metal locker where he kept the antibiotics, painkillers, and dried herbs. His supplies were limited. Whatever remained had been meant for him. He stared at the plastic vials. Penicillin, 2 doses left, one for her or one for himself. His breath caught. Logic screamed, "Don't waste it. She's an animal. She's already dying. She's not your responsibility." But something deeper, older, whispered back, "She came to you. She trusted you. Would you let her pups grow up motherless?" He took one of the vials and set it on the table. His hands hovered over it, clenched into fists. His chest ached, not from the cold, but from a knot tightening behind his ribs. He wasn't just making a decision about medicine. He was standing at a crossroads. Later that night, he sat on the floor beside the wolf, watching her sleep. Her breath was ragged. The firelight shimmered off her fur, turning the streaks of red to copper. She was beautiful even in pain, regal, wild, fragile. He ran a hand through his unwashed hair. Memories bled in like cracks in a dam. The last time he'd been in a hospital room, Anna's fingers in his. Lily's laughter echoing in the hallway. The moment he'd said goodbye. The moment he'd chosen not to go with them. Just one more trip. Just a short flight. "Go without me," he'd said. "I'll be here when you get back." He hadn't been. They hadn't either. The plane went down during a freak storm, much like the one that had passed through just yesterday. Search and rescue found pieces. Not much more. He buried an empty coffin. He buried his soul with it. He hadn't helped anyone since. Hadn't touched another living soul. Hadn't even allowed birds to nest near his porch. He had become a fortress of solitude, his heart locked tighter than the ice on the lake behind the cabin. And now, this creature had arrived, clawed her way through snow, carrying life and suffering in trust. He looked at the vial again. Helping her meant breaking the rules, wasting medicine, risking disease, inviting wild nature into his sanctuary. But not helping? He looked at the cubs. They were awake now, looking at him with wide, golden eyes. Not afraid, not growling, waiting, hoping. A flicker of a memory. Anna, whispering as she tucked Lily into bed. Kindness is never wasted, no matter how small. His jaw clenched. He reached for the syringe. I knew the rules, but I couldn't just watch it die. With trembling fingers, he injected the penicillin into the soft flesh of her thigh. The mother wolf flinched, let out a low growl, but didn't bite, didn't move, just breathed. He sat with her the entire night. Days passed. The infection receded. Slowly, her leg remained stiff, but the swelling went down. The fever broke. The pups began to explore, sniffing corners, chewing on firewood, even pawing curiously at Griffin's boots as he walked. And still, the war inside him raged. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. By day, he taught the pups not to chew electrical cords and fed them soaked jerky and boiled rabbit meat. They slept curled near the fire, sometimes beneath his chair. One of them, smaller than the other, with a limp tail, began following him everywhere. He named it Ash. By night, he lay awake, wondering what he had done. He dreamed of Anna's voice, of Lily's giggles, of wolves running through the snow beneath a full moon and a fire that never went out. One morning, a snowmobile engine roared in the distance. Griffin's entire body went rigid. He rushed outside with his rifle. A figure appeared at the tree line, tall, dressed in orange, carrying a pack and a tranquilizer gun. A trapper. Griffin hadn't seen another human being in nearly 3 years. And this one had no idea what he'd just stepped into. He hid the pups beneath the floorboards and covered the mother wolf with blankets. When the man arrived, he acted cold, curt, distant. Looking for wolves. The man said casually, "Lost a deer to a pack. Set some traps up the ridge last week. Might have caught something." Griffin's heart beat like a war drum. "I haven't seen any," he lied. The man shrugged. "They're out here. Always are. They'll die without a pack." He laughed as he walked off. "If you see one, shoot it. They don't belong near cabins." Griffin watched him disappear into the trees. He returned inside and locked the door behind him, breath shaking. If he reported the wolves, they'd be hunted. If they stayed too long, they might lose their wildness. But if he sent them away too soon, they'd die. No matter what he chose, something would break. That evening, the mother wolf stood for the first time. Wobbly, weak, but upright, her eyes locked on his. Griffin stared back. No fear, no growl. Something passed between them, a silent contract. He stepped closer and reached out. She allowed him to touch her neck, his fingers brushing through thick fur. Her breath was steady now. Her wounds had closed. They both had. She looked toward the door, then back at her pups, then at him. Griffin nodded. He understood. The next morning, he opened the front door wide and stepped aside. The wolves, mother and two pups, stood at the threshold. The snow outside glittered under pale sunlight. The wind had gentled. She turned and looked at him one last time. Griffin knelt. "Thank you," he whispered, "for coming to me." The smaller pup, Ash, ran back to him, circled his boots, and then bounded after the others. They vanished into the trees without a sound. He closed the door, and for the first time since the crash, since the silence, Griffin wept, not from pain, but from the beautiful, unbearable ache of healing. The sun didn't rise the next day. It hovered like a ghost behind thick clouds, casting the world in a steel-blue haze. Griffin stared out over the valley from his porch, the trail of paw prints already vanishing under new snow. The silence that had once comforted him now pressed too heavily on his chest. He kept thinking he'd hear a howl, but the wolves were gone, and so was the sound of breathing beside the fire, the soft scratch of paws on the wooden floor, the quiet heartbeat of something alive besides himself. He was alone again. He stepped back inside, leaving the door ajar. The cabin felt larger somehow, emptier, like a lung that had exhaled and forgotten how to draw breath again. Ash's little bite marks were still on the leg of his table. The mother wolf's fur still clung to the wool blanket by the fire. He stood still listening. Not a sound, not the wind, not the woods, nothing, just the deep, aching absence of something that had mattered. That night, the storm rolled in without warning. One moment the trees swayed gently, whispering secrets between themselves. The next, the sky roared, a sound like the world tearing open. The wind came howling down the mountain, tearing snow from branches, snapping limbs, shaking the walls of cabin. Snow flew sideways, thick and furious. The world turned white. Griffin rushed to bolt the shutters, reinforce the roof hatch, and drag extra firewood inside. His training took over, his hands moving fast, but his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't felt this afraid in years. Because now, for the first time in so long, there was something to lose again. By midnight, the storm was at full strength. The cabin groaned like an old ship at sea. Ice slammed against the windows like thrown stones. The chimney screamed. Griffin sat by the fire, the room flickering orange and gold, heart hammering. He couldn't stop thinking about them, the wolves. They were out there, somewhere. The pups, barely old enough to walk. The mother, still healing. They wouldn't survive this. Not without shelter. Not without him. He stood up suddenly, grabbed his coat, and pulled it on. Hat, gloves, flashlight, rope. The wind nearly tore the door from its hinges when he opened it. He staggered outside into a wall of white, nearly blind. Every step was a war. He called out. Useless, he knew, but still he howled. Just once. A raw, ugly sound torn from a throat that hadn't spoken in hours. He waited. Nothing. Then a cry. Not a howl. Not a bark. A yip. High-pitched. Close. He turned. Through the swirl of snow, two shapes stumbled toward him, half buried. The pups, frozen, whimpering, exhausted. He dropped to his knees and scooped them into his arms. No, 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 he muttered, feeling for breath, for a pulse. One was still moving. The other, barely. He turned in a panic, about to head back, and then he saw her. The mother wolf. She stood at the edge of the woods, eyes wild, legs shaking. She brought them back, brought them home. Their eyes met again, just as they had that first day, not as man and beast, but as something older, something ancient, two souls in the storm. She didn't follow. She turned, faced a blizzard, and collapsed. Griffin hesitated only a second. Then he ran to her. Inside the cabin, the storm raged. But within those four wooden walls, a fire burned brighter than it ever had. He laid the pups near the hearth, wrapping them in thick towels and rubbing them gently, whispering to them through clenched teeth, come on, stay with me." They blinked, shivered, cried softly, alive. Then he returned to the door, dragged the mother wolf inside once again. Her fur was ice-crusted, her eyes barely open, but she was breathing. He worked for hours, melting snow, feeding her broth through a dropper, warming her with heated cloths. He moved like a father, like a medic, like a priest at some sacred ritual. This time, there was no question in his mind. They were family now. The storm howled for 2 more days. They rode it out together, man, wolves, fire, and memory. Griffin didn't sleep. He didn't eat much. He barely left their side. And something changed in him. Not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, gently, like frost melting under spring sunlight. The walls of his cabin, once bare and lifeless, became filled with motion and breath. The air itself seemed warmer. The silence now hummed with presence. And for the first time in years, Griffin spoke freely. He talked to them, really talked, about Anna, about Lily, about the guilt, the wreckage, the way he'd punish himself for surviving. "I thought I didn't deserve to live," he whispered one night to the sleeping pups. "So I came here to disappear." The mother wolf lifted her head then, as if she'd been listening all along. "We saved each other," he said, staring into her eyes. She didn't blink. By the time the storm passed, the forest had changed. Trees had fallen. The river had shifted course. Entire hills were buried in new snow. But in the clearing where the fire still burned, where man had made room in his heart again, life had returned. The mother wolf stood tall once more. Her wounds had healed. Her strength had returned. She walked through the cabin now with silent dignity, checking on her pups, watching Griffin with calm understanding. The pups played near the door, pouncing on his boots, howling to the distant woods. Griffin smiled often now. Sometimes he even laughed. Not loud, not like before, but real. One morning, he took down an old box from the shelf. Inside were drawings Lily had made, crayon sketches of wolves and forests and fires. One was titled, "The Man Who Keeps the Fire Alive." Griffin stared at it for a long time. Then he pinned it above the fireplace. Days turned into weeks. The forest began to thaw, and the wolves began to stir. Something in them had changed, too. They were stronger now, braver, ready. Griffin could feel it. They wouldn't stay much longer. And somehow he was okay with that, because this time the leaving wasn't an ending. It was a return. One evening, as the last light of day bled across the snow, the mother wolf stood at the door. She looked back at him, waited. The pups followed. Griffin opened the door wider. The forest greeted them with soft wind and light falling snow. They stepped outside. The mother paused. The smallest pup, Ash, looked back, hesitating. Griffin knelt in the doorway, eyes misting. "Go on," he whispered. "You got a whole world waiting." Ash ran to him once more, pressed his nose to his palm, then turned and vanished into the trees with the others. Griffin stood in the doorway long after they disappeared. The wind wrapped around him like a scarf. The fire crackled behind him, and in the quiet that followed, he was no longer alone. The seasons shifted quietly. Snow loosened its grip on the trees. The wind grew warmer, softer, less a blade, more breath. Icicles melted in slow tears from the eaves of the cabin. The river beyond the ridge began to murmur again, a whisper returning to the forest. Spring had come to the Yukon. But Griffin knew the real change had taken place inside. For weeks now, the wolves had stayed nearby, never too far from the cabin. He would catch glimpses of them between the trees at dusk. The pups chasing each other through pine needles, the mothers standing watch, still and regal. They never came too close. They didn't need to. A new understanding had been forged, not of ownership, not domestication, but of trust, of respect, of letting go. Griffin had repaired the broken fencing near the back, not to keep anything in, but to mark a line, a boundary, a place between two worlds. He had even stopped locking the door. Something in him no longer feared being open. He spent his mornings differently now. Where once he'd moved through tasks with robotic precision, with chopping, water boiling, equipment checks, he now paused to breathe, to listen. He brewed his tea slower, letting it steep while he watched the sun rise across the mountains. Sometimes he would take Lily's sketchbook out to the porch and flip through the pages, her wolves dancing across colored paper, little stick figure versions of himself holding torches or standing beneath stars. She had drawn a version of him surrounded by wolves. He smiled at it now. It no longer felt like a fantasy. It felt like memory. Then one morning they didn't come. No sign of paw prints near the stream. No rustle in the trees. No golden eyes at dusk. Griffin waited. All day. Into night. Nothing. The next day, the same. The forest was alive. But the wolves were gone. They had returned to the wild. He felt it deep in his chest. There was no ceremony. No howl. No goodbye. Just absence. But this time, it didn't hurt the same way. This time, the silence felt like a blessing. That evening, he sat by the fire and held a photo of Anna and Lily. It had yellowed with age. The edges curled like old bark, but the image still burned. Anna's wind-blown hair, Lily's gap-toothed grin, the bright red scarf around her neck. He closed his eyes and let the heat from the fire wrap around him. You would have loved them, he whispered, and they would have loved you. He felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for too long. The tears came easily this time, but they were soft, cleansing, free. He wasn't crying because they were gone. He was crying because he could finally remember them without breaking. The next morning, the snow was almost completely gone. Grass had begun to pierce through the white. Birds returned. The sky opened wider, clearer than it had in months. Griffin stepped outside and looked at the ridge where he'd last seen them. A breeze moved through the trees, and for a moment he thought he saw a shape, a flash of gray, a tail, a figure watching from the edge. But when he blinked, it was gone. He didn't chase it. He didn't call out. He simply nodded once and whispered, "Thank you." He spent the rest of the morning building something new, a second fire pit, a little further from the cabin. It wasn't for cooking, not for survival. It was a place to remember. He laid stone in a ring, smoothed the earth, and placed one of Lily's drawings inside a sealed glass jar beneath the center stone. Then he lit a small fire there that night. It flickered under the stars. The wolves didn't return, but the warmth stayed. Inside the cabin, life went on. Griffin cooked, cleaned, repaired his maps. He even reopened the emergency radio transmitter, fixed the antenna, rewired the battery, not to call for rescue, but to listen to the world again, to belong again. One last snowfall came in mid-April, light and silent, a gentle farewell from the long winter. Griffin stepped outside, snowflakes melting on his hands, and whispered, "I'm ready now." And he was alive, but this time really living.